Hello, I'm Robert Paul Wolff, and this is the second in a series of lectures on the subject of ideological critique. Those of you who watched the first lecture in this series, will recall that at the beginning of my first lecture, I remarked on how strange I found it to be lecturing to a camera rather than to a group of students. I think the word I used was weird. Anyway, one of the people who watched that first lecture wrote me an email suggesting that perhaps I should imagine myself to be talking to a group of my students rather than to a camera, maybe former students from my past life as a professor. That struck me as a good idea, and I decided that in each of the lectures that I give, I will start with a shout out to one of my former students. That way, I can imagine that I am speaking to that person, to him or to her, instead of just talking to my desk and to a camera. I've chosen as the first student for my shout-out Jennifer Jensen Wallach. Jennifer wrote her doctoral dissertation under my direction in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts in the late 90s. I've chosen Jennifer in part because just last month she gave birth to her first child, a little boy named Augustine Jensen Wise. Jennifer has written 3 books and has edited 4 others, and in fact was in the midst of writing her 4th book when she had Augie. When I received the first copy of the book, which she sent to me, I opened it. Here it is. It is entitled Closer to the Truth Than Any Fact: Memoir, Memory, and Jim Crow by Jennifer Jensen Wallach. When I opened the book, I discovered to my delight that it had been dedicated to me. You can't read it from there, but here is the dedication page, and you see right there it says, for WFP. You're puzzled. My name is Robert Paul Wolff, so my initials are RPW. Who is WFP? Well, there's a story that goes along with that dedication, and although it has absolutely nothing to do with ideological critique, I thought I'd tell it to you before I get started today. When I joined the Afro-American Studies Department in 1992, I was invited by Esther Terry to join the department, she was the chair then, to help in the creation of a groundbreaking doctoral program in Afro-American Studies, only the second in the world, which I did. And those 16 years that I spent in that department until I retired in 2008 were absolutely the best part of my entire career. But of course, when I joined the department, even though I was at that time in my late 50s and had published 20 books on philosophy, I knew next to nothing about Afro-American studies. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that I knew less than the undergraduates who were majoring in the department. So I didn't actually do much teaching in the department. Instead, I took on all of those tedious administrative chores that academics hate to do but have to be done in a department. Once we created the PhD program, I served for 12 years as the graduate program director. I was the chair of the admissions committee. I was the chair of the personnel committee. I was the principal fundraiser for the department. Indeed, I was the only fundraiser for the department. I was, you might say, the Shabbos Goy of the Afro-American Studies Department. If that Yiddish term is not familiar to you, I'll just explain that in the Orthodox Jewish settlements in East Europe, the shtetls, the inhabitants followed such a strict code that on the Sabbath they were not permitted to do any work, and that included even lighting candles, for example. So what they would do is to hire a little Christian boy from the next village down the road, and he would come in on the Sabbath, and he would do all the jobs that they were not permitted to do. And he was called the Shabbos Goy. And I was essentially the Shabbos Goy of the Afro-American Studies Department. The students loved me, of course. I was good old Bob, and I raised the money that gave them fellowships and teaching assistantships. Whenever there was a problem with the graduate school or with the rest of the UMass administration, I was the one who ran interference for them and sorted things out. So obviously they liked me a great deal. But they didn't think much of me as a scholar. If they wanted to know something about Afro-American studies, they went to John Bracey, or they went to Esther Terry, or they went to Ernie Allen, or Mike Thelwell, or any of the other members of the department who really knew something about the subject. This used to get on my wick from time to time. I mean, I thought I was pretty accomplished by then. I'd built up a certain reputation, and they knew nothing about it. But that was okay. I just went on doing my little Shabbos Goy chores. Well, one day, Jennifer was sitting in my office, and we were talking about her dissertation. I couldn't give her much actual concrete advice about it, since I knew so little about the subject she was writing about. But I knew something about writing dissertations, so that was some help. And something she said, I can't remember what it was, communicated the fact that although she was very pleased to have this help, she didn't really think I was much of a scholar. And finally, something inside me snapped. And I said, you know, Jennifer, you may think I'm just a pile of chopped chicken liver, but actually I'm a world-famous philosopher. Well, Jennifer has a puckish sense of humor. And so she started calling me the WFP, the world-famous philosopher. And that is why this book is dedicated not to RPW, but to WFP. It's one of my treasured possessions. Well, let's get back to ideological critique. You'll recall that in my last lecture, I started with what was a sort of snap definition of ideological critique. Ideological critique, I said, is the demonstration that a putatively value-neutral and objective description of the world actually conceals a thoroughly interested distortion of reality in the service of some social or economic group. Now let's expand on that idea. In order to qualify as ideological, a description or an interpretation of the social world must exhibit three characteristics, and all three of them are essential if it is to be truly an ideological statement. First of all, this statement must serve to justify the power and defend the interests of a dominant political, economic, or social group, and it must make fundamental change away from their dominance seem unlikely. In short, this must be a rationalization of their superior position, their controlling position in the society. Second, in order to be truly an ideological statement, this statement must distort reality in some way. In short, it must be false. And third, it must be so patently false that only interested bias, not genuine intellectual error, can explain why it is believed. All three of these: first, that it justifies the power of a dominant group in the society; second, that it distorts reality, it is false; and third, that it is so obviously false that only interested bias could lead somebody to believe it. All three of those are required in order for a statement in the full sense to be ideological. Let me take you through some examples to show you what I mean. Consider first this statement: capitalism is the most productive economic system ever devised. Clearly, this statement serves very nicely to justify the power of the ruling class in a capitalist economic and social order. Since capitalism is the most productive system ever devised, ever brought into existence, those who are running it must be justified in being in charge of it. They must be in some way the cause of this enormous productive output. The trouble with that, however, is that it is true. Capitalism is the most productive economic system ever devised. As Karl Marx, for example, himself said, Marx was fond of saying that capitalism was the most revolutionary force ever unleashed on the world. And he spent a lot of time describing all the different ways in which it had completely transformed the European economic, social, and political order that preceded it. So it is true, and therefore it is not ideological. It just happens to serve the interests of the ruling class. Well, sometimes true statements do serve the interests of the ruling class. Let me give you a second example from a totally different area. This is going to come from Aristotle, 2,400 years ago. Aristotle, as you may know, was one of the great philosophers. Those of us in philosophy all know Aristotle. He was the pupil of Plato, who was the disciple of Socrates. How's that for a trifecta? And Aristotle wrote on virtually everything, not only on metaphysics and logic and physics and ethics and politics, but even on things like biology. Now, Aristotle's most important analytic or conceptual distinction was the distinction between form and matter. And he used that distinction in every one of the works that he wrote. He found a distinction between form and matter everywhere. And it was always the case that form was what carried the interesting and important elements in anything, and matter was just the stuff out of which it was made. So form was premier and matter was very much secondary. Well, in one of his least well-known works, something called The Generation of Animals, Aristotle undertakes to talk about reproduction in animals, and more particularly in human beings. And he says this. By the way, I was going to pull down my copy of The Generation of Animals from my shelf. Right up there, though you can't see it, are the books that start, the authors start with the letter A, and there's a row of books by Aristotle. But unfortunately, although I have a number of the volumes of the marvelous Oxford English translation of the works of Aristotle, I never bothered to buy the volume which contained minor biological works. So I had to find this on the web, and I'm happy to say that the web never disappoints. Here's what Aristotle says. As the first efficient or moving cause to which belong the definition and the form is better and more divine in its nature than the material on which it works, it is better that the superior principle should be separated from the inferior. Therefore, wherever it is possible and so far as it is possible, the male is separated from the female. For the first principle of the movement or efficient cause, whereby that which comes into being is male, is better and more divine than the material whereby it is female. You're groaning. I groaned when I read that. This is transparently an ideological rationalization of the patriarchal system of ancient Greek society, in which the men were the dominant force and the women were consigned to the household, where they were put in charge of economy, which in Greek, in the original, meant household affairs. Clearly, therefore, it meets the first test. It justifies and rationalizes the superior position of men in Greek society. What is more, it is false. But, and this is the crucial point, Aristotle had absolutely no way of knowing that it was false, because neither Aristotle nor anybody else in those days, or for a long time after, had a clue about the actual process of reproduction. He didn't know about X chromosomes, he didn't know about Y chromosomes, he didn't know about mitosis or meiosis, he didn't know how conception takes place, he didn't know that the male and the female each contribute half of the chromosomes, which then reproduce to make the fetus and the fully grown new individual. And he also didn't know, as we now do, that the X chromosome contributed by the male is a stunted and poor relation to the Y chromosome, is a stunted and poor relation to the X chromosome, which is contributed in the case of males by the female. So a male has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, a female has two X chromosomes, and the Y chromosome is really a stunted, poor thing. I think it would have freaked Aristotle out had he actually known that, but fortunately for him, he didn't. So this is a case in which, although the statement justifies the superior position of one segment of society, and although it is false, it is not in the full-scale sense an ideological statement, because it is not so patently and obviously false that only self-interested bias could lead one to assert it. Aristotle just had the wrong story about reproduction. Mind you, he thought that story up, obviously, because it seemed clear to him that it had to be the male who contributed the more important part. But he had no way of knowing that it was false. Let me now come to a third example which satisfies all three of those criteria. And here what I'm going to do is come back to the present and talk about a phrase which you may all be familiar with from recent political debates: makers and takers. In the intellectual world of conservative think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, all those places where these deep thinkers hang out and find ways of justifying Republican Party policies. It has been an article of faith that the real important people in American society are the CEOs of the great corporations and the owners of capital. These are the makers, the people who create jobs, the people who invent things, the people who make the world different, who produce the cornucopia of goods and services that we all consume. And that at the other end are a group of dependent, miserable human beings who don't make but take. They rely on the government to support them. They rely on them for food stamps. They rely on them for health care. And this makers and takers phrase became very popular in Republican circles 4 or 5 years ago. They have, by the way, since decided that they don't want to use that phrase anymore. They haven't changed their mind about the world. They've just decided that one didn't work out too well politically. At any rate, this was their shorthand expression of the conservative conviction that America is divided between worthy, admirable, hardworking, deserving, independent wealth creators, which is to say Republicans, and lazy, unworthy, dependent wealth destroyers who expect the government to take care of them, which is to say Democrats. The most famous expression of this makers and takers distinction was in Mitt Romney's infamous 47% statement from the 2012 presidential campaign. For those of you who don't know the story, although I suspect most of you do, Romney was attending a private Florida big donor dinner for fat cats who were going to be wooed to give money to the Republican Party. And since it was a closed dinner, no press, no outsiders, nobody taking notes, he felt he could speak freely. And here is what he said. I found this online, by the way. Google tells you everything. Here's the actual quote. He said, "There are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what. All right, there are 47% who are with him, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they are victims, who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. That's an entitlement, and the government should give it to them, and they will vote for this president no matter what. And I mean, the president starts out with 48, 49%. He starts off with a huge number. There are people who pay no income tax. 47% of Americans pay no income tax, so our message of low taxes doesn't connect. So he'll be out there talking about tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that's what they sell every 4 years. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives." That's the famous 47% statement. Now, there were no reporters there, so how do we know what he said? He certainly didn't release this statement to the press, and in fact, from the wording of it, it's pretty clear that he was speaking somewhat off the cuff. Well, the answer is quite simple. A waiter named Scott Prouty, who was working at that dinner, surreptitiously took his cell phone, set it up unobtrusively on a side table, and recorded the entire event. After it was all over, he decided to release it to MSNBC, and the statement went viral, more than viral. I think it shaped the election after that. Now, first of all, this is a statement that is clearly and self-evidently rationalizing and justifying the authority and power of those who have a great deal of money. And in a moment, I'll talk about the fact that it is also false. But the interesting question is, why didn't it occur to Romney that waiters and such are people who might listen to what he said? And the answer is pretty obvious, because he doesn't think of them as people. He is so accustomed to be, he was and still is, I assume, so accustomed to being waited on by polite, deferential, efficient, quiet wait persons in every part of his life that they simply disappear from his view. He doesn't think of them as people, he just thinks of them as part of the silverware and the cutlery and the china at the dinner. So he didn't notice Scott Prouty. Let me interrupt my exposition just for a minute to tell you about an experience I had, which was very much like that. In 1986, I went to South Africa for what would turn out to be the first of 35 or 40 such visits over the next 30 years. I was there to lecture on the thought of Karl Marx to the second-year philosophy students at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, university which is usually referred to as WITS. Well, the chair of the WITS philosophy department was a man named Jonathan Sussman, a member of an old and rather wealthy South African Jewish family. And Jonathan invited me one day to go to dinner at the Rand Club, a very tony and elegant private club in downtown Johannesburg. Incidentally, although he was now a member of that club, his grandfather, who made the money in the family, had been denied membership in the club because he was Jewish. But things had loosened up, and Jonathan was now a member. So I borrowed a tuxedo, one of only 5 times in my life, I think, when I've worn a tuxedo, and off I went with Jonathan Sussman to have dinner at the Rand Club. It was a very select little dinner with only 5 or 6 or 7 people there. And they were all movers and shakers in South African society. There was the president of one of the biggest banks, there were several other wealthy businessmen, and in particular there was the editor of one of the leading English language newspapers. Not the Mail and Guardian, for those of you who know South Africa, by the way, but a right-wing newspaper that was a supporter of the apartheid regime. This was a time when the ANC had been banned, and the military wing of the ANC, something called Mkhonto we Sizwe, had set up camps in neighboring Botswana from which it was launching small-scale military raids against South African targets. Well, the South African government had launched a program of bombing raids on those Botswana camps. And the editor of the newspaper had some inside information about this. And since this was a private dinner, and there was nobody there but us insiders, I was considered an insider sort of by courtesy since I was Jonathan Sussman's guest, he shared some of that information with us. Except, of course, we weren't alone, because the dinner was being served to us by quiet, deferential, efficient black waiters who stood there in case we wanted a little bit more wine, or we wanted another cup of coffee, or we wanted to have our plates cleared away, or a napkin fell on the floor, and the waiter would pick it up for us. And as I sat there listening to this editor talk, I wondered to myself idly which of the waiters in the room was an ANC plant and would, as soon as the dinner was over and the dishes were washed up and put away, go off to his ANC contact and tell him everything that he had heard. It just never occurred to anybody in that room, except me, I guess, that these waiters were people who might actually play a role in the politics and the struggle that was going on in South Africa. Well, let me come back to this statement about makers and takers. The covert meaning is, of course, that whites are makers and non-whites are takers, but that wasn't what Romney was focused on. The overt meaning was that owners of capital are makers, those receiving social welfare transfers such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, aid to dependent children. Those are the takers, not the makers. Whose interests does this description of America serve? Corporations, wealthy individuals, their political representatives. Is the statement false? Yes, the statement is patently false in 2 fundamental ways. First of all, it is false because the rich receive corporate welfare. They receive from the government handouts which are quite large and without which they wouldn't be making the profits that they make. They also benefit in a variety of other ways from government activity and government payments. And it's false in another way, because the working poor are the real economic makers. Those are the people who do things. Those are the people who make the goods and provide the services that add up to the gross national product. Now, the statement is so patently, is the statement patently false? So patently false that only interested bias, not genuine intellectual error, can explain why it is believed. And I think the answer is yes. Consider the dinner at which the statement was made. Who is making the food? Who is serving the food? Who is clearing the tables? Who's washing the dishes, sweeping the floor after the rich makers have left the room? It's those people whom Romney considers takers, the people who are going to vote for President Obama, the people who depend on food stamps, perhaps, because they can't make enough as waiters to feed their families. These are the people who actually do something in the society. So the statement in all three ways qualifies, I think, as a genuinely ideological statement. That actually raises an interesting question, and I think it's worth talking about, even though it's somewhat of a digression from the subject of ideological critique, but it will get us deeper into an understanding of just how that statement is ideological. We might ask the question, what do the owners of capital actually do in a capitalist economy? What does capital do? What do capitalists do? A capitalist is somebody who owns capital. Well, one possible answer is they manage the capital. But that's not a correct answer, as any economist would know if he thought about it for just a little bit, which economists, by the way, tend not to do, no matter how smart they are. The people who manage the capital, the managers of the great corporations, are employees of the corporation. They make enormous amounts of money, of course. And one of the things they are successful in doing is taking some of the profits of the corporation and diverting it from the owners, the shareholders, to themselves in the form of very high salaries and bonuses. But they are employees of the corporation. You can tell that they are employees because the money they get is listed on one side of the ledger as expenses against income. It's not listed on the other side as profits after the expenses have been deducted. Their salaries are part of what it costs to run the corporation, and therefore they are employees of the corporation. That is actually what they do. Now, the owners of the corporation are the people who own the shares of stock and get the dividends if they decide to pay some. Do these managers invent new products? Do these owners invent new products or techniques of production? Well, on rare occasions they do. Steve Jobs did, and Bill Gates did, and Edwin Land did, the man who invented the Polaroid camera. There are inventors, and they make a lot of money when they capitalize on their inventions. But most of the people who own capital are not at all inventors. 4 of the 10 richest people in the United States are heirs of the Walmart fortune. And none of them has worked a day his or her life, and none of them has invented anything. They simply inherited huge amounts of stock from old Sam Walton. And that characteristically is true of capitalists in general. Capitalists qua capitalists are not managers, they are not inventors, they are owners of capital. Nor is it the case that owners of capital engage in painful self-denial to accumulate the capital. That, of course, was the great early 19th century story, that the people who became rich as capitalists were people who denied themselves consumption and saved what they had, saved the little extra that they set aside until they became rich. Many a mickle makes a muckle, this is what the Scots say. Well, many a mickle makes a little pile of mickles, it doesn't make a muckle. If you start off as an apprentice and you end up as an enormously rich capitalist entrepreneur, you didn't get that way through self-denial. You got that way in some other way, namely, you got that way by taking some of what your employees produced and what they made and appropriating it for yourself. So what is it that capitalists do in a capitalist economy? Well, when I was thinking about this some while back, I thought of an old movie I had seen, a Burt Reynolds movie called Stick, which is a film version of an Elmore Leonard novel. It's actually a 1985 movie, and I doubt that any of you has ever seen it. But I remembered in it a bit of dialogue that perfectly captured what capitalists do. And sure enough, I went online and I was able to find the script of the movie Stick and to locate that little bit of dialogue just to set up the scene for you. Stick, played by Burt Reynolds, is a car thief who's done time in the Florida State Pen. And when he comes out, he moves to Miami to get a job. And a friend of his is killed by some mobsters who are drug pushers. And Stick decides that he wants to get revenge. But before he sets out to get revenge, he goes to see a man named Nestor, who is the big mob boss in Miami. And here is the dialogue in that scene. Nestor is living in a very elegant apartment in a very ritzy high-rise, and Burt Reynolds goes to see him. And Nestor says, "Are you a foolish man, Stick?" "I used to be." "You don't think it foolish to come into my home?" "I have no quarrel with you," says Stick. "Chucky, huh? That's the name of the friend who was killed. And 5,000 you say he owes you. He does owe me. What do you want?" And this is the key. Stick says, "Permission." To what? To go after Chucky. Chucky is the gangster who killed his friend. To go after Chucky. And now Nestor says, "And how do you know to ask permission?" "I did some time in the joint," Stick says. "I did it well. I learned you always have to ask permission. Everything's the same whether inside or out." When I heard those lines, it really rang in my head, because that is the perfect explanation of what capitalists do in a capitalist economy. They give permission. They own the capital, the factories, the raw materials, the machinery, the tools. They own the patents, the scientific techniques that are needed in order to produce the goods and services that the society needs. And that ownership is backed up by the police, and if necessary, by the military. And they won't give permission for workers to use that capital unless they get a nice fat profit out of it. So what capitalists do, just like this mob boss, is they give permission. They say, yes, you may use the capital. And once they say, all right, you may use the capital, then workers can go to work. That is all that capitalists do. They give permission. Everything else is done by employees, even if they're high-paid corporate executives. Capitalists give permission. The entire superstructure of neoclassical economics is erected to distort this truth and make it appear that a nation's wealth is the product of the cooperation of two makers, capital and labor, each of which, under ideal circumstances when not distorted by giveaways to the undeserving, is paid its appropriate share, what the mathematical economists like to call, incorrectly, its marginal product. Well, this is not the place to explain to you why that is a load of nonsense. But no matter how smart these economists are, and they are among the smartest people in the academy, they are really quick when it comes to mathematics and things like that. They can't see past their own ideological rationalizations to recognize that their justification of capitalism is not only false, but so obviously false that that only interested bias on their part can block them from recognizing that. Well, enough of capitalism. Let's get back to Mannheim. At this point, Mannheim introduces a distinction which plays an important role in his exposition between what he calls the particular form or concept of ideology and the total concept of ideology. And since I've been talking a good deal, let's return to Mannheim, and I'll read you a bit of what he has to say. For those of you who are following along by actually doing the reading, this is on pages 55 and 56, and then 56 and 57 of Ideology and Utopia. Mannheim says this: "The particular conception of ideology is implied when the term denotes that we are skeptical of the ideas and representations advanced by our opponents. They are regarded as more or less conscious disguises of the real nature of a situation, the true recognition of which would not be in accord with their interests. These distortions range all the way from conscious lies to half-conscious and unwitting disguises, from calculated attempts to dupe others to self-deception. This conception of ideology, which has only gradually become differentiated from the common-sense notion of the lie, is particular in several senses. Its particularity becomes evidence when it is contrasted with the more inclusive, total conception of ideology. Here we refer to the ideology of an age or of a concrete historico-social group, for example, of a class, when we are concerned with the characteristics and composition of the total structure of the mind of this epoch or of this group." So we have the particular and then we have the total conceptions of ideology. And he goes on a little bit later, whereas the particular conception of ideology designates only a part of the opponent's assertions as ideological, and this only with reference to their content, the total conception calls into question the opponent's total Weltanschauung, including his conceptual apparatus, and attempts to understand these concepts as an outgrowth of the collective life of which he partakes. It is this notion of the total concept of ideology which is most interesting and for Mannheim most problematic. So long as we are only talking about the particular conception of ideology, it is quite possible for Mannheim to distinguish distortions in someone's thinking process from his more general, or her more general, but for Mannheim it's always his, more general rationality. So a person may be rational about the world and be somebody whom you can talk about and quote facts to and so forth about the world, but when it comes to this particular area, this person is blinded by interest, by parti pris, and therefore speaks ideologically. But when you generalize to the total conception of ideology, to what he calls a world view, or in German Weltanschauung, then the entire way in which the individual sees the world and understands it, that entire way is colored with the interested bias of this person's class position, and there's nothing to grab onto, to break into it, to get at it, and to expose to the person himself or herself the ideological nature of the belief. And that really upsets Mannheim tremendously, because he is committed, and was committed, to finding a way to reintroduce rational discourse into public social debates after we have understood the ideological distortions that are introduced into those debates by interested bias. And if we are talking about a conflict between two Weltanschauungen, two total world views, there seems to be no way at all of finding any kind of basis for a rapprochement. Once again, I'll allude to my first trip to South Africa. At one point, I was invited to go to dinner in Pretoria. I was based in Johannesburg. Pretoria was 3/4 of an hour away to the north. And I went up there and went out to dinner with a chap whom I'd met at Wits and a third person, a man named Koos Pauw. Koos Pauw was a philosopher who taught at the Rand Afrikaans Universiteit, or RAU, or RAU as it was called, but who also served in the apartheid government as the number 3 man in the Department of Education. Koos Pauw was intelligent, well-educated, sophisticated, and completely a defender of apartheid, and of the world view of which apartheid was a part. And it's a much larger view than simply a political view, but I don't have the time to go into all of that. Talking to Koos Pauw was for me an extremely disorienting experience. It was like having dinner with a sophisticated, charming Nazi. We could talk about Kant, we could talk about Aristotle, we could talk about Husserl, we could talk about philosophy, we could talk about academic things, and it would appear that we were on the same page and were talking together as fellow academics. And yet, again and again and again, things would come up in which it became clear that we were absolutely and completely in different worlds. There was no argument I could give that would unsettle Koos Pao and make him begin to rethink his commitment to apartheid. And there was no argument he could give that would make me begin to think that perhaps apartheid was a good thing. It was a very, very strange dinner, in part because in the same restaurant that evening were a group of representatives of one of the 3 Dutch Reformed churches that dominated the religious life of Afrikaner South Africa. They happened to be there at a meeting where they were trying to decide whether to admit non-whites to their church. By the way, they decided not to, surprisingly enough. But sitting there looking at all of these Boer Boers with their square beards and their Boer expressions, and talking to this graceful, charming man, Koos Pao, who was in the most elegant way explaining the rationale of apartheid to me, really made me feel as though I had come unglued from my moorings. What can Mannheim do about this? Well, Mannheim has, in fact, a solution. Let me read you first a passage from page 99 to set this up. Mannheim says on page 99, if we examine the many types of ontological judgments with which different groups confront us, we begin to suspect that each group seems to move in a separate and distinct world of ideas, and that these different systems of thought, which are often in conflict with one another, may in the last analysis be reduced to different modes of experiencing the same reality. Now this is, for Mannheim, very unsettling. He goes on, he says on page 103, there arise divergent and conflicting modes of thought which, unknown to the thinking subject, order the same facts of experience into different systems of thought and cause them to be perceived through different logical categories. That was basically what was happening to me and to Koos Pao. That's a perfect description of the way in which we were confronting one another. And now Mannheim comes up with his solution. It is, I have to say, a pathetic solution. Understandable, but rather touchingly pathetic. Here is what he says. This is rather further on in pages 154 and 5. He says, a true synthesis, that is to say, a synthesis of the different worldviews, is not an arithmetic average of all the diverse aspirations of the existing groups in society. If it were such, it would tend merely to stabilize the status quo to the advantage of those who have just acceded to power and who wish to protect their gains from the attacks of the right as well as the left. On the contrary, a valid synthesis must be based on a political position which will constitute a progressive development in the sense that it will retain and utilize much of the accumulated cultural acquisitions and social energies of the previous epoch. At the same time, the new order must penetrate the broadest ranges of social life, must take natural root in society in order to bring its transforming power into play. This is Mannheim's dream of some kind of progressive unification of the competing world views. This position calls for a peculiar alertness towards the historical reality of the present. The spatial here and the temporal now in every situation must be considered in the historical and social sense and must always be kept in mind in order to determine from case to case what is no longer necessary and what is not yet possible. Now, who is going to carry out this synthesis? If everyone in the society is in the grip of a worldview, a Weltanschauung, which is an ideology, if everyone is seeing the same world from a different interested perspective, Who is there left in the society who can bring about this integration? And Mannheim says, such an experimental outlook, unceasingly sensitive to the dynamic nature of society and to its wholeness, is not likely to be developed by a class occupying a middle position, but only by a relatively classless stratum, which is not too firmly situated in the social order. The study of history with reference to this question will yield a rather pregnant suggestion. This unanchored, relatively classist stratum is, to use Alfred Weber's terminology, the socially unattached intelligentsia. The socially unattached intelligentsia. In short, Mannheim's solution to this impossible problem of how we can get the competing worldviews integrated in a way that attends to the realities of the world and gets past the interested biases that distort the view of the world, is to look to a particular group of individuals in the society who are not the members of any social class and who therefore are capable of achieving a non-interested, non-biased, objective view of the world. And who are they? Mannheim and his fellow intelligentsia. Intellectuals. Now, as I say, it's touching, but it's pathetic. How Mannheim could have imagined that of all the people in the society, the only ones who are not tied to a class are himself and his fellow intelligentsia, members of the intelligentsia. How he could have failed to see how totally self-deceiving such a view is, I don't honestly know, except that he was living at a time when it seemed desperately important to him to find such a solution. Mannheim's not the only thinker who has held this view. To take a more recent thinker, it's essentially the view of John Rawls. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, tells us that under the veil of ignorance, individuals will arrive at principles of justice which can be recognized by all as objectively valid. And what do those principles of justice turn out to do? Basically, they turn out to rationalize the conditions of living, the social conditions of a particular part of American society, namely upper middle class university professors as elite universities. I've explained this at length in my book, Understanding Rawls, and I won't go into it further here. Suffice it to say that it seems always to be the case that when intellectuals grapple with this problem of the unget-overable opposition between alternative and competing worldviews, they imagine that they and they alone are the natural people to overcome these conflicts and to arrive at an objective and universal view of the world as it is in itself. Not so, alas. Well, that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Jennifer, I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, a different student will get a shout out, but I hope Jennifer will return. Maybe by the end of these lectures, I will have 10 or so students imaginatively sitting in front of me instead of just that camera that I have been speaking to. I will see you all next week. Thank you.